Wyoming Territory, 1882. The wind screamed over the high plains like it was trying to rip the past away, but the girl in the saddle couldn't forget a thing. Mara Keaton held the reins tight in her frozen fingers, her skirt stiff with dust and cold, her eyes locked on the jagged line of the bighorns on the horizon. She had not eaten since yesterday, and the mare was limping now, but she kept riding. There was no going back. Behind her, two graves. Her sister and her sister's no-good husband, buried quick and shallow beneath a cottonwood tree. And two small children left behind in her care, Olivia and Owen, now curled under a blanket in the wagon she dragged across the prairie. Abandoned like she had been once. Not again. Not on her watch. The wagon wheel cracked two spokes just after sunrise, and Mara knew she would not make it to Sheridan before nightfall. She climbed down, knees buckling, and tried to brace it with a rock. Her fingers shook too hard. "I'm not brave enough," she whispered, pressing her forehead to the wheel. "Well, then I'll be brave for both of us." The man had ridden out of the morning haze like something out of a story, tall in the saddle, rifle strapped to his back, a wide-brimmed hat casting shadows across a face that had seen dust and war and maybe worse. He dismounted before she could speak, stepping forward with quiet purpose. His name was Gideon Hartley. He said it soft, like he did not expect it to matter. But when she looked up at him, something in her chest unlocked. "I saw the wagon tracks," he added, glancing toward the children. "Figured someone was in trouble." Mara straightened, her pride raw and bleeding. "I can manage." "I don't doubt it," Gideon said, crouching beside the wheel. "But you do not have to do it alone." His hands were steady as he braced the wheel with a broken fence post from his pack. The wagon groaned but held. Mara stared at him. "Why are you helping me?" He looked over at the children nestled inside the wagon. Olivia, barely 5, peeked out with wide eyes. Owen, 6, held a stick like it was a sword. "Because they need you," Gideon said. "And you need someone." The wind cut between them. Mara wanted to cry, but she had not cried in 2 years, not since her sister first showed up at the boarding house in Cheyenne, blackened eye and a baby on her hip. "I'm not just passing through," Gideon added. "I run a line camp west of here. You're welcome to rest there if you like. Just the 3 of us and a couple old mules that do not bite unless asked." Mara looked at the children. Olivia was shivering. Owen's eyes were rimmed red. "I do not know you," she said quietly. "You will," he replied and tipped his hat. They followed him. The cabin sat in a low hollow between 2 hills, built from thick pine logs and chinked with red clay. There was a hand pump out back and a corral nearby. The door creaked, but the fire inside was already lit when Gideon pushed it open. He fed them stew from the pot hanging over the fire. Mara ate slow, watching the way he moved, gentle with the children, quiet with her. He did not ask questions. He did not press. That night, Mara tucked Olivia and Owen into the bed Gideon gave up for them. She sat by the hearth, the flames licking shadows across the walls. Gideon handed her a mug of coffee. "I do not drink coffee," she said. "You do tonight," he said. She drank it. In the morning, the children were laughing. Gideon showed Owen how to split kindling, his big hands guiding the boy's small grip. Olivia followed him like a shadow, clutching her faded rag doll. Mara stood at the edge of the porch, arms wrapped around herself. "I will find work," she said when he joined her. "I can sew or clean." "You do not owe me anything," Gideon said. "I do not take charity. I am not offering that. I am offering you peace." She looked at him. "That does not come free." "No, but sometimes it comes shared." She swallowed hard. The wind pulled at her skirts. "I do not want to be a burden." "You are not." She wanted to believe him, but fear clung to her like a second skin. "I am not brave enough," she said again, voice breaking. He reached out then, his hand warm and solid as it wrapped around hers. Then I will be brave for both of us." Mara did not pull away. The days passed slow and quiet like a song with no words. Gideon taught Owen to ride a pony. Olivia followed Mara in the mornings, helping hang wash on the line. Gideon fixed the wagon wheel one afternoon, whistling while he worked, and Mara found herself watching the line of his shoulders, the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled at the children. One evening after supper, with the sun gold over the hills and the fire crackling, Mara sat beside him again. "You live out here alone." "I did," he said. "Before you," she looked at him, heart pounding. "You do not even know me. I am learning, every day." She felt the warmth of him beside her, steady as the earth. "I want to stay," she whispered, "but I'm scared." "I know," Gideon said. "But I'm not. Not anymore." Mara looked at their hands, resting side by side on the bench. Slowly, she slid hers into his. He closed his fingers around hers without a word. That night, Mara fell asleep with the children curled against her and peace blooming in her chest like spring after a long, frozen winter. She was not alone anymore. By late March, the snow began to retreat from the gullies and rise in wet clumps off the cabin roof. Mud lined the trail between the shed and the spring, and the cottonwoods wore swollen buds, waiting. That season between freeze and thaw stretched long and uncertain. Mara hung laundry in the wind, sleeves flapping like unanswered questions, and watched the hills for signs of green. Gideon had taken to riding out before first light, checking his grazing line and scattering coyotes that trailed too close to the cattle. He returned with his shoulders damp from snowmelt, and his voice softer than it had been in those first days. He never came back, empty-handed, sometimes a twist of dry sage for the hearth, sometimes a feather for Olivia, who tucked it behind her ear like a secret. Mara had mended every scrap of cloth in the cabin by then. She'd set her needle aside and started teaching Owen to read from the remnants of a Bible she'd carried in the wagon. They sat cross-legged on the cabin floor while Olivia hummed to herself, wrapping twine around corn cobs like they were dolls. One afternoon, with the children asleep in a nest of quilts, Mara stepped outside and found Gideon seated on a stump near the corral, sharpening a knife. He did not look up as she approached. "You've been quiet lately," she said. He paused, tested the blade against his thumb, then set it aside. "I'm trying not to say the wrong thing." "You haven't yet." Gideon rested his arms on his knees. "You've been watching the hills like they're keeping something from you." She sat on the step, folding her hands in her lap. "I wasn't sure if we were staying." "You're still wondering?" Mara turned toward him. "No, not after yesterday." He waited. "Owen had a bad dream," she said quietly. "He called out for his father. Then he woke and wrapped his arms around me like I was a raft in deep water." Gideon gave a slow nod. "I used to think I had to outrun everything behind me," she added, "but maybe it's not about running at all." He looked at her then, not searching, just seeing. "You ever think about what comes next?" she asked. "Every morning I wake up and don't dread the day," he said. "That's what comes next." Mara tucked her hair behind her ear, her fingers brushing the curve of her cheek. "I haven't felt safe in a long time. I know. I still flinch when the door opens too fast. I leave it ajar now, just in case." She drew a breath, slow and careful. "I noticed." They sat in silence after that, the kind that settled rather than strained. A meadowlark called from the fence post and something eased in her chest. "You miss anything?" she asked. "Sometimes I miss noise," Gideon said. "Not shouting, just the kind that fills space. Laughter. Music maybe. My mother used to hum while she worked." "I haven't thought of that in years." "What happened to her?" "Fever, back in Kansas, before my sister married." Gideon didn't press. "She used to say if you rub rosemary between your fingers it helps you remember joy." "They teach that at church?" "No." She learned it from an old woman who lived by the river. Said her great-grandmother was Cherokee. He studied her for a long moment. Funny how memory gets stitched into scent. It's the only thing that doesn't leave. Gideon stood then, brushed the filings from his hands. There's a patch of wild rosemary near the bluff. I'll show you when it comes up. She looked up at him, surprised. You know where to find it. I know how to listen. That night, Mara lit a candle instead of the lantern, the glow gentler on the walls. She watched Gideon take off his boots and set them by the hearth without a word. The children were already asleep, their breathing even when he turned. She was holding something in her hand, her sister's thimble, worn smooth along one edge. I thought I'd lost this, she said. You hadn't. She traced the rim with her thumb. I used to think I needed to keep every piece of her to feel like she was still near. And now I think she'd want me to let go of the worst of it. Gideon crossed the room and crouched beside her, his voice low. You're not the same woman who crossed the plains alone. No, she said, meeting his eyes. I'm not. He reached up and brushed a loose strand of hair from her forehead, his touch light as breath. I don't know how to do this, she whispered. Neither do I, he said. But we'll learn. Mara leaned in then, not out of fear or flight, but because something inside her had begun to settle. When he kissed her, it wasn't rushed. It was patient, like planting something and trusting it would grow, and outside the wind didn't feel as sharp. The lambing ewes arrived 3 weeks into April. A neighbor's herd Gideon agreed to watch while the man traveled to Cheyenne to settle a land dispute. They came in bleeding clusters, dragging mud and birthing straw behind them, and filled the pen beside the barn with the sharp scent of wet lanolin and new life. Mara had never tended sheep before, but she took to it with the same quiet resolve. She gave everything. She stayed up through the first night, checking for breech births, warming chilled lambs against her shift. Olivia, half asleep, padded out at dawn and wrapped a blanket around her shoulders without being asked. You're too small to be out here, Mara whispered. I'm not, the girl said, curling into her side like a cat. Gideon passed them both a tin cup of milk boiled with honey and nodded toward the rising sun. You're doing more than I'd hoped, but you don't have to prove anything. I'm not proving, Mara said, eyes fixed on the pen. I'm building. That evening, Gideon set a kettle of bathwater over the fire and handed Mara a bar of lye soap that smelled faintly of lemon balm. She blinked at it, then looked up at him. It's not a suggestion, he said. Go, I'll watch the little ones. She hesitated. You sure? I've got hands, don't I? He turned before she could say more, already crouching to help Owen with his boots, Olivia giggling as she draped a towel over his head like a bonnet. Mara stepped behind the hanging quilt that served as a screen and sank into the wash basin, the heat climbing into her bones. She had forgotten what it felt like to breathe without bracing. Later, wrapped in one of Gideon's flannel shirts and her hair braided down her back, she stood outside the barn watching the sky turn to cinders. He joined her without speaking, just leaned on the rail beside her, thumbs hooked in his belt. She studied the horizon. I never thought I'd live this quiet. You miss the noise. I miss knowing what came next. You still don't. I know what I want, she said, then paused. But wanting and believing are two different things. He looked at her, not hard, just steady. What do you want? I want a place that doesn't disappear when I stop moving. You've been here nearly 2 months. I haven't let myself believe I could stay. Gideon nodded once. I've been waiting for you to claim it. She turned to him, her voice low but firm. I'm claiming it now. He stepped closer. You're not afraid anymore. I still am, she said. I think I always will be. Gideon reached out, brushing his fingers against her cheek. Then I'll carry what you can't. She leaned into his touch, the warmth of it anchoring her. Do you think it's too soon, she asked, to begin again like this? No, I think we've been beginning since that first morning. She smiled, not wide, just enough to soften her face. You always speak like you've already thought it through. I have. Only thing I hadn't figured was whether you'd take my hand when I offered it. She took it now. No hesitation. Inside, Owen's voice rose in song, a tune with no words, just long vowels and the rhythm of a child who feels safe enough to be loud. Olivia clapped along, the beat uneven but joyful. Mara listened, her hand still in Gideon's. I think they're healing faster than I am. They're lighter, he said, but you're catching up. She looked up at him. What do you want, Gideon? He didn't flinch. A home. A woman who meets my eyes and doesn't flinch when I reach for her. A table with more than one chair filled, and someone to walk beside me when the days get long. Mara's breath caught, not from fear this time, but from how quickly his words settled into her. I can be that, she said. If you're patient. I've been patient most of my life. She stepped into him then, wrapped her arms around his waist and rested her head against his chest. You're warm, she murmured. You've been cold too long. The breeze lifted her braid, and somewhere in the field, a lamb bleated for its mother. She closed her eyes and let the moment root. By the time the peach trees bloomed behind the cabin, just 5 spindly things Gideon had planted years back without much hope, Mara had begun stitching curtains from old feed sacks, rubbing them with crushed mint to soften the smell. She didn't speak of it. She just hung them one morning while the kettle whistled and Owen chased Olivia around the yard, both of them barefoot and pink-cheeked. Gideon stood in the doorway, watching her tie the last knot at the window's corner. You're making it yours, he said. I'm making it livable, she answered, not turning around. He waited. When she glanced at him, he nodded once and stepped back outside. That afternoon, Gideon saddled 2 horses and tied a third behind, leaving the children with Miss Lottie, an older woman who lived 2 miles down the slope and knew how to keep little fingers safe from fire and sharp tools. Mara had only met her once, but trusted the way Olivia leaned into her side without flinching. Mara climbed into the saddle without asking questions, which told Gideon more than words would have. She hadn't ridden since arriving, hadn't quite trusted the ground not to fall out from under her. But now she sat straight, skirts gathered neat, her hands steady on the reins. They rode west, toward the draw where the land dipped into cottonwood and alder. The sky stretched wide and cloudless, pale blue like laundry left too long in the sun. They didn't speak until the trees closed around them, the hush of leaves overhead pulling silence from their throats. Gideon slowed his horse near a bend in the creek, dismounted, and tied the reins to a low branch. He waited for her to do the same. There's something I want to show you, he said. She followed him down a narrow path that twisted between rocks, ducking under branches until the woods opened to a clearing no bigger than a parlor, with a flat stone in the center and wild rosemary thick along the edges, blooming small white stars. She drew in a breath and crouched low, running her fingers through the leaves. The scent broke over her like warm rain. It's been here since before I came, Gideon said. I didn't plant it. Mara looked up. You remembered. I remember everything you say. She didn't answer right away. Her eyes tracked the edges of the clearing, the way the sun painted silver along the rosemary tips. I never had a place like this, she said. Somewhere quiet. I did, Gideon said. Once, before the war, there was a creek behind my mother's house. I used to sleep under the dogwoods when I could get away from the shouting. What happened to it? Burned, along with the house. I never went back. She stood, brushing her palms on her skirt. I never had anything to go back to. He stepped closer, his voice low. Then maybe we build forward. She reached out, touched his wrist. The way you look at me, it scares me sometimes. I'll stop if you want me to. No, she said. Don't. They rode back slow. The sun dipped low as they crested the final ridge. From there, the cabin looked small beneath the swelling sky, chimney smoke curling soft into the wind. Mara pulled her horse to a halt and looked down at it for a long time. "I never thought I'd feel anything but tired," she said. Gideon didn't speak, just waited. "But today I don't feel worn out. I feel," she swallowed, "like I'm about to become someone I haven't met yet." He reached for her hand across the space between the horses. "Then let's meet her together." When they dismounted, the children ran to them. Owen held a crooked wooden spoon he'd carved under Miss Lottie's guidance. Olivia tugged at Mara's skirts, laughing about a story Lottie had told involving a dancing pig and a preacher's daughter. Mara bent to listen, brushing a curl behind Olivia's ear. Then, standing, she turned to Gideon. "Will you help me put in a garden?" she asked. He blinked once, then smiled, wide and sure. "I'll dig until the blisters come. You tell me what to plant." She stepped forward, her voice lower now. "Rutabaga, beans. And maybe something sweet. I'll find you seeds." As the sky deepened to indigo, Gideon lit the lantern and Mara set about heating water. The children settled near the hearth, their heads close, whispering secrets. She looked across the room to Gideon, who was peeling potatoes with his sleeves pushed up, a quiet rhythm in his movements. Without thinking, she crossed the floor and touched his back. He turned, surprised. She said, then stopped. He waited. "I want to learn what makes you smile." He leaned forward, his forehead resting against hers. "This." She closed her eyes, breathing him in soap, earth, and smoke. A smell that felt like staying outside. Wind moved through the grass, and the first stars blinked above the chimney. Inside, nothing stirred but the soft sounds of children, fire, and the beginning of something lasting. The spring rains came late that year, waiting until the soil had cracked and the creek ran low. When they finally arrived, they came in a slow, soaking hush that turned dust to loam and softened everything it touched. Mara stood barefoot on the porch, the hem of her dress damp, watching the rivulets trace paths down the steps. Inside, Gideon was oiling the hinges of the barn door, pausing to listen each time the wind shifted. The rain had brought a stillness that wasn't silence, more a sense of the world holding its breath. "I never minded the sound of it," Mara said, her voice quiet. Gideon looked up. "The rain," she nodded. "It makes me feel like things are growing, even if I can't see it yet." He set the oil can aside and joined her on the porch, his shirt sleeves rolled to the elbows, cuffs darkened by work. "I built this place with the hope someone might stand beside me in weather like this," he said. Mara glanced at him, surprised at the frankness in his voice. "And now that someone is, it's more than I expected." She reached for his hand, letting her fingers rest against his palm. "For me too." Later that week, Mara took the children to the field above the bluff, where the sun had coaxed early shoots through the damp soil. Olivia carried a woven basket, and Owen trailed behind with a stick he insisted was a surveyor's staff, mapping trails between the patches of wild onion and yarrow. Mara knelt to show them how to pull the onions gently, keeping the roots intact so they might grow again. Her fingers were stained with earth, her hair pinned high to keep the sweat from her neck. When they returned to the cabin, Gideon was repairing the fence post that had sagged after the thaw, his brow shaded by his hat, his shirt plastered to his back. He looked up when he heard them. "You find much?" "Enough to flavor supper," Mara said, "and some yarrow for drying." Gideon stood and dusted his hands. "Good. We'll need it once heat sets in proper." That night, with the children asleep and the coals low in the hearth, Mara sat at the table, darning a rip in Owen's trousers. Gideon poured water into the basin for washing and paused, watching her hands move. "You ever think about having more?" he asked. She looked up. Children, he nodded. She set the needle aside. Do you? I think about what it would mean to bring a child into a place like this. Not for want, but for welcome. Mara considered his words before answering. I think I would like to carry something new, not just in my arms, but in my days. He stepped closer, voice low. I'd like that too when you're ready. There's nothing left to wait for, she said. We've already begun. The next morning, Gideon hitched the wagon and drove them to the town's edge, where a circuit preacher was calling together folks for a spring service beneath a canvas tent. Mara wore the dress she'd sewn from calico traded with Miss Lottie, and Gideon had trimmed the children's hair the night before, Owen solemn beneath the shears, Olivia giggling at every snip. After the service, they stood before the preacher, Gideon's hand curled around hers, his thumb tracing the inside of her wrist. The vows were brief, the words plain, but when he looked at her and she looked back, there was nothing simple about it. It was full and certain and quiet in the way of things that last. They rode back under a sky washed clean, the wagon creaking gently, Owen dozing against Gideon's side, Olivia's fingers tangled in the folds of Mara's skirt. That evening, Mara stepped into the kitchen where the floor was warm against her bare feet. She found Gideon at the table, carving a wooden box with careful hands. What's it for? She asked. He looked up. For letters. I thought we might keep a record of where we started. She smiled. Then we'll need plenty of paper. He set the knife down and stood, reaching for her waist. We'll fill volumes. Outside, the wind shifted through the trees, carrying the scent of damp grass and something sweeter, maybe the peach blossoms, maybe just the air itself learning to carry joy again. Years passed. They did plant a garden and the land took to it. Beans came easy and the rutabagas stubborn. They built shelves from pine and painted the shutters blue. Mara taught Olivia how to dry herbs without losing their scent, and Gideon showed Owen how to read a horse's ears before touching the reins. One autumn, Mara bore a son in the back room of the cabin, her cries swallowed by the wind. Gideon held her hand through every breath, and when the child wailed for the first time, she wept not from pain, but from knowing there was nothing she had to run from anymore. They named him Illy, after Gideon's father, and he grew with laughter in his bones and dirt beneath his nails. The cabin never grew grand, but it grew full. With stories, with peace, with the kind of love that doesn't shout but settles deep and stays. And every spring, when the rosemary bloomed along the bluff, Mara walked there barefoot, her youngest child in her arms, the others trailing behind, Gideon at her side. And she would kneel, brush her fingers through the leaves and remember not what she'd lost, but what she had built from the ashes of it. A home. A family. A life that held, and Gideon, always Gideon, beside her through it all, steady as the land they'd chosen to belong to.